What's the weirdest thing you've seen your neighbor do? Had a neighbor who always picked up trash on our street. Great, except dude liked to run the hose over them and hang them up to dry. Bottles, paper, clothes, food, cigarettes, you named it. After drying the stuff out, he'd throw the stuff away. Just imagining him with a clothesline and pegs, pinning cigarette butts to it. I lived in a rural area for a few years and my next-door neighbor showered her son naked in the backyard with a hose, no curtains or anything. That wasn't the weird part. The weird part is that she did it until he was 13. Time to go hose down the boy again. There isn't one specific thing as they seem like regular people and we never really interact with them at all, but my parents' neighbor lives in a massive house and was unemployed when he and his wife, also unemployed, moved in. He then trained for and now serves as a priest in the Russian Orthodox Church. No one knows how he can afford to live in this house. It's literally a mansion. My parents live in a nice neighborhood but this house dwarfs all the others on the block, and a few months after they moved in the county DA knocked on my parents' door and asked what we knew about these neighbors. When my parents said nothing really. The DA told them to be on the lookout for suspicious behavior. The whole thing is really weird and we suspect some sort of organized crime involvement and or money laundering situation. Edit. For those of you saying look into it, etc. The couple moved into the house about 12 years ago and the DA or whoever it was showed up a few months later. Since then, nothing. They still live there, quietly, and we haven't noticed anything amiss. There are always different cars in the driveway, which I guess could be interpreted as suspicious, but we've never heard any noise or disturbances, and they're good neighbors in the sense that they keep to themselves and we've never been bothered by them or anything that has or hasn't happened on their property. I live in Michigan. Most winters we get a lot of snow. The house next door has never had the brightest people living in it. Woke up one day to the fire department parked in the street. Apparently my neighbors thought they could save time shoving snow by just covering their driveway in gasoline and melting it. They would also burn trash all the time. Did it at least melt the snow? Yeah, they melted the snow. But it snows a lot here so. Guy's house was foreclosed on so he locked his dogs in the backyard, set his house on fire, and tried to escape via canoe on the intercoastal. He got about 3 blocks before the Coast Guard picked him up. He got arrested. Dogs are fine. My neighbor looked over his fence, looked at me straight in the eyes and said the last time I looked at somebody like this, they died a week later. After that he just went back to his business like the conversation never even happened. Edit. I was about 8 when he said this to me. So I spent the next week living in fear. I'm alive and well, duck you, Ray. Consider yourself lucky to be alive. Mine sits in his hedge watching my husband and I working. We run a farm, and then he copies what we are doing. He wears camo and thinks we can't see him. This one is hilarious to me. Like he doesn't know how to farm so he's trying to learn by watching you too. Andy Circus method training for a live-action animal farm. He likes to play his violin in the small forest between our houses in the early hours of the morning. Scares the duck out of me. Is he good? I expect he thinks he's far enough out not to bother anyone and just wants to enjoy his music and the nature around him. Unless he's just practicing scare chords. One night I stepped out to walk to the liquor store and my neighbor across the street was sitting on his porch playing the piano accordion. When I say playing, I mean absolutely shredding. This old Italian guy in his 60s just kicking ass. I waited till he was finished and gave him some applause. He called out a quick thank you. And launched into another tune. What a legend. My neighbor regularly sits in his car, which is parked in his garden, and just revs the engine. His dad got him the car years ago and he has never been able to pass his test so he just revs it. Sometimes genuinely for hours. I think there's something wrong with him. Edit. Some more info because my inbox is dead now. The guy in question is around 30 to 33, he has had the car for about 6 years. It never moves, it is basically planted in his lawn. He does not work on it, he uses it for nothing other than hours of revving. He comes out in the afternoon, with a can of beer or something, sits in his car and revs the engine silly for between 30 minutes and 3 hours. He has clearly given up on his driving test and seems quite happy with the revving game. It is not about charging the battery, the car serves no other purpose and you would just disconnect the battery if you weren't using it for 6 years. Sometimes his little brother comes out during the revving and cuts up pallets with a saw. That is probably for firewood but seeing the two of them at it is really bizarre. She followed us when we went on vacation and stayed in the same hotel. Did she have a reason for why she was traveling? Or was it blatant stalking? Just dedicated to her role as a neighbor. My bedroom was on the side facing the street, and at least twice a month the neighbor across the street would end up sleepwalking naked in his front garden. I'd get woken up by their blinding lights coming on, then if I ever peeked out, he'd either be pissing, standing military still, rubbing his crotch, or just sitting on the grass. He was 65. Very confusing. Note: I'd wait 10 minutes for the lights to go off, for him to go inside, or I'd get up and wake his wife. He never left his property when sleepwalking. Saw him spreading his ass cheeks in front of his air conditioner. Nothing wrong with some sweet fairy kisses on your log cutter. We live in an older neighborhood with chain link fences. You can see pretty much everything in the neighbors' yards. We have one neighbor who feeds stray cats, and he'll stand in the backyard every evening and call them to dinner. He's a big man with a huge belly, and he stands on his back porch in his boxers calling the cats by name. Here fat boy. Here cry baby. Here big mama. Kitty kitty kitty. In this really high-pitched call. It lasts about 10 minutes, and due to some weird acoustics it sounds like he's right outside my window hollering for the cats. I peek through the blinds, and there he is in his underwear on his porch calling the cats. Mow his lawn in a thunderstorm. One of my neighbors does this, also waters the grass when it's raining. I think your neighbor might not be okay. Masturbate on her lawn chair. She was about 48 at the time, sunbathing nude. I was about 15. Yes, I did think about that a lot in my alone time. Wonder what would have happened if you did the awkward, "Hey, need some help?" Ha. She wasn't massively attractive. But hey, 15 and seeing a woman masturbate is enough for the wank bank. Shoveled my driveway for me while drunk at 10 p.m. He didn't do an amazing job, but I appreciated the intent. An A for effort. My neighbor regularly sits in a chair in his garage and just sits there for hours. And it's not like his garage faces the street, so it'd be comparable to someone sitting on their porch. His garage faces my garage/house, so that's pretty much all he has a view of. He also has a back porch which faces his backyard and woods, but he never sits back there. He's a pretty nice dude, and I've pretty much gotten used to the obligatory exchange of hey when he's there when I leave the house or get home. But for the first few months I lived here, it'd really creep me out that 9/10 times I'd go to leave or pull in the driveway, he'd just be there, facing me, sitting in a lawn chair in the middle of his garage. My next door neighbor is a sweet elderly lady. I once saw her mopping the carpet in front of her door in the apartment hallway. It struck me as weird, but I'm not so sure now. I love her, she gave me a hug. About time. This carpet was due for a good mopping. After a big snowstorm, he took this 20-foot pole thing and started stabbing the snowbank at the end of his driveway with it. He just sat there for an hour sticking the pole through the entire snowbank, in different spots, and then went inside and did nothing else. Edit, thing pole thing. Standing in front of the window and slowly undressing. Then trying on pair after pair after pair of underwear while another gentleman sits on the bed looking on approvingly. This wasn't really weird per se, but to 6-year-old me it was. To 21-year-old me, it's hilarious. So I had this neighbor Dane. She was maybe in her 40s and had this husband, I think his name was Steve. Anyways, my dad and I are driving home from somewhere, and as we're pulling down the street I see Dane throwing clothes out of her second-floor window and screaming. But while she was doing that, she was also pouring bleach out the window too for whatever reason. Steve is in the yard begging her to stop, and she keeps going. So I said to my dad, naive 5-year-old me, "Dad, Dane is doing her laundry wrong. Stop the car now so I can tell her." Yeah, my dad rushed me inside. Found out years later that Steve was cheating on her, and that was her way of kicking him out. I'm Filipino and grew up in the suburbs of the Philippines. Once the neighborhood got word that an American family was moving into one of the houses near us, everyone got curious, especially us kids. We'd never seen white people before, except on TV. The family was pleasant enough and we were encouraged not to treat them differently. The kids became our friends and we played together a lot. They were just like any other family. But the weirdest thing they did, which I'll never forget, is when the family went abroad in September. They came back in February. Then, the parents went door to door, asking all their neighbors to help them out, apparently, since their kids missed Halloween. They were going to trick or treat in February, in costume. They gave every house candy that we were supposed to give back to their kids when they did their trick or treating. We all participated since there was no harm in doing so, plus they gave us extra candy to keep for ourselves. But the image of their kids trick or treating in full costume at 9 a.m. in the middle of February has always stuck with me. I even asked my parents at one point why they were doing that, and I was just told it's because they're American. My apartment neighbor below me walks onto her patio and pushes her wind chimes. She has two sets, one on one end of the patio, and the other at the other end. She does this in succession. Once one stops, she walks to the other. She does this 6-ish times a day. She was on the phone the other day, and she was explaining this to whomever she was speaking with, saying, "I do this all the time, it must really annoy my neighbors. It's not that bad." So this actually is my parents' story, but they don't read it, so here you go. My parents live on a single-lane dirt road about a mile back into the woods. It was originally strip mining ground that my great-grandfather owned and passed down. There are 4 houses on said road that all belonged at one point in time to various members of our family. Now, however, after several deaths, only the 2 middle houses, my brothers and parents, remain in the family, while the first and last house were sold off to random families. Basically what I'm trying to get at is that it is a remote area, and if you aren't going to one of those 4 houses, you have no business on this road. Backstory complete. So this story occurs about a year ago. The family that lives in the end house, furthest from the highway, is going through some money trouble. The bank forecloses on their home and they move away. Fast forward about 6 months. The house is still empty and fallen into a state of disrepair as the woods are starting to reclaim their area. It's a weekend night and my dad is out of town on business. My mom is outside boarding up her shed because there are supposed to be severe thunderstorms and tornado warnings in the area starting any minute. As the raindrops start to fall, a black car with tinted windows speeds past her, almost running her over, and down to the vacant house. In her words, a big person in a black hooded raincoat gets out of the car and starts wandering around the property. Then goes back to his car and gets out a shovel and proceeds to start digging in the corner of the yard. By this time it's raining very heavily and the person is still digging. My mom is watching out the window because she's scared as shit. Like I said, this is remote and you pretty much know everyone who should be there and this person shouldn't. So this goes on for a while and the person has a huge hole dug. Then they go back to the car and pull out what my mom says looks like a body wrapped in a sheet, and put it in the hole, and start filling it in. Cue a freak out. My mom calls 911 and in about 15 minutes state police are rolling down this dirt road that's basically a mud pit at this point in numbers. So the state police surround the vehicle and have the person in the black hooded raincoat surrounded, guns drawn. This is a 1-lane dead-end road, so there's no escape. They take him into custody. A few minutes later the police come and inform my mom that the person was actually the old neighbor who the bank foreclosed on. His large dog had died and he wanted to bury it in his old house. He had bought a new car with tinted windows, why my mom didn't recognize it, and didn't see her outside, why he almost hit her with the car, and was too emotionally distraught to realize that digging a grave in a severe thunderstorm/tornado in a remote house that you haven't lived in for several months was a bad idea, or at the very least poor timing. TLDR, neighbor's house gets foreclosed in remote area. Save era. Months later he returns at night in thunderstorm, digs grave, buries dog. Mom doesn't realize it's him, gets crazy scared. Cops come, happy ending. I was the weird neighbor apparently. Early 20s me bought a house whilst I was still at uni. Mostly I had lodgers, but one Christmas I didn't. So it was just me for all of December and January. January it snows pretty badly. For the UK, I hadn't seen snow like that for years. I get excited. I'm a big kid at heart. So I decide to build a snowman. It's fairly late at night and I've been drinking. I didn't have outdoor lighting for the back garden, so I thought I'd build my snowman in my small front garden. I built a glorious snowman. But then I decided he was a bit dull. Over the next few hours I dressed him in a variety of outfits, including a Viking beard, helmet, and club, a burlesque outfit, complete with snow tits, corset, top hat, and whip, a pirate hat, beard, eye patch and cutlass, and as a vampire with blood dripping from his fake fangs. I finally got bored with this about 1 a.m. and went to bed. 2 weeks later the previous snow has melted away, but it's snowing again. As I return from work, the woman across the street races over to ask me if I'll be entertaining them again tonight. I look blank. Apparently her and her family had some friends over that night and had sat in the dark watching me and my snowman costume party. She wanted to know if I was planning a repeat performance so she could get her friends over. I live on the second floor of a 2-floor apartment. I was outside, walking down the steps to the ground, when my next-door neighbor just walks outside and throws an entire plate of spaghetti over the side of the balcony onto the bushes below. I looked up at him like WTF? And he just stared at me and said I made too much spaghetti and walked back inside. He was secretly making an offering to the flying spaghetti monster and he didn't want you to judge him. Touched by his noodly appendage. My neighbor used to hit golf balls at his own house. He would dump a bag of golf balls on the grass and proceed to bounce them off of his house with a 9-iron. He broke a window once and just kept on swinging like nothing happened. Through the open bathroom window I hear, Richard. What? You bought the wrong diapers, Richard. These are for babies. They are yelling because they are old and can't hear. They yell everything. Richard left to go back to the store. Neighbor on one side of me left his surprisingly hot wife. Then he started banging the guy on the other side's mother, who was in her 60s, on my neighbor's deck, the one that faces the street. My theory: other side guy had sex with your neighbor's wife, and your neighbor was getting revenge. Thanks for listening to another episode of Reddit X. Subscribe and activate the notification bell so you won't miss any stories. Feel free to share your own stories below in the comments. Have a good day.